Good evening, everybody, and I'm thrilled so many people managed to come to this event. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of familiar names. My name is Neve Gordon, and I'm the Vice President of the British Society for Middle East Studies and the head of the Committee on Academic Freedom. And we are happy to host here tonight Dr. Somdeep Sen, Associate Professor of International Development Studies at Roskilde University, to deliver a talk on his new book, Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas Between the Anticolonial and the Postcolonial, which was published late last year by Cornell University Press. Now, this is BRISMES, or the British Society for Middle East Studies, is happy to be hosting this event alongside the European International Studies Association, the British International Studies Association's Colonial, Postcolonial and Decolonial Working Group, and the Global Development Section of the International Studies Association. It is unusual for four professional associations with a combined membership in the thousands to join forces and to host an event together. Indeed, I cannot remember throughout my career of any such event. And what brings us here together is not only our interest in Dr. Sen's talk, but also the very troubling way that the University of Glasgow treated Dr. Sen, and our growing concern over ongoing attacks on academic freedom and the redefinition and weaponization of anti-Semitism to stifle critique of the policies of the Israeli government. While we are still waiting for a Freedom of Information request that has been submitted to the University of Glasgow to find out exactly what happened there, what we know so far is already very troubling. After Dr. Somdeep Sen accepted an invitation from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Glasgow, the university received a complaint from its Jewish Student Society. In the email's subject, Dr. Sen's lecture was characterized as anti-Semitic, and in the one-paragraph complaint that the student group sent, they reiterated this charge and claimed that claiming that the university was hosting an anti-Semitic lecture by Dr. Sen. The complainers also noted that members of the society were deeply concerned with the book's messaging and this talk's repercussion for Jewish students, claiming that the talk would have consequences for the safety of Jewish students on campus. The initial correspondence, a potentially career-ruining accusation, was sent by the students on the 30th of September without any kind of supporting material, needless to say, evidence. To the best of our knowledge, the university did not alert the students that such accusations are defamatory and potentially libelous, and has failed to date to initiate an investigation into the matter. We do know that the university did not wait to receive any supporting material from the students before asking Dr. Sen to provide information about the content of his talk. Following BRISMES intervention, Dr. David Duncan, Chief Operating Officer and University Secretary at the University of Glasgow, wrote to Dr. Sen that the event can proceed with the proviso, and I'm quoting, that you do not say anything during the presentation that breaches UK anti-terrorism legislation, bearing in mind that the military wing of Hamas is a proscribed organization under the UK's Terrorism Act. Dr. Duncan then added, and I'm again quoting, May I also respectfully remind you that the university has adopted the IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism. Three dots. I hope you will agree that this definition does not prevent you giving a presentation based on your book. The Chief Operating Officer's letter echoes what has become a familiar strategy, whereby anti-Semitism and terrorism discourses are weaponized and then mobilized to discipline those who support Palestinian rights. They have become tools harnessed to silence Palestinian histories and experiences. Dr. Duncan's intervention may well constitute unlawful direct discrimination against Dr. Sen on the grounds of philosophical belief, as well as unlawful indirect discrimination on the grounds of race and/or religion or belief contrary to the 2010 Equality Act. We have now asked our legal consultants to look into this. Moreover, according to Dr. Duncan, the University of Glasgow is using the IHRA's working definition, which has been characterized as not fit for purpose by experts in the field, as a code for identifying hate speech despite the fact that it has no legal basis. This, the four professional associations co-sponsoring this event today believe constitutes a gross overreach, which in effect stifles academic freedom and freedom of speech, and in this particular case seems to have been mobilized along racial lines. Indeed, I give plenty of talks on Israel-Palestine, and I've never been asked by a university to pledge my allegiance to the IHRA or to say that I'm not a terrorist or do not support terrorism. So at least seemingly there is a racial component here too. I should emphasize that BRISMES, EISA, and the working groups and sections of BISA and EISA oppose anti-Semitism and racism of all kinds. And we recognize our obligations under the 2010 Equality Act to prevent discrimination, harassment, and victimization of individuals on the basis of their race, ethnicity, or religion. Concurrently, we believe that we are now treading in very dangerous waters where the war on terror and accusations of anti-Semitism are being systematically mobilized to curb academic utterances and research, and what might add, following recent events at LSE, to also stifle student activism and freedom of speech. This is unacceptable, and we should not let it pass. In a sense, however, the advocates of the IHRA have already won. Since instead of focusing on critical engagement with Israel as an inherent part of the scholarly work of understanding empire, colonialism, and racial capitalism, we are continuously dealing with the false charge of anti-Semitism. And indeed, different university working groups around the country are now fighting the adoption of the IHRA definition in their universities. It is, I believe, vital for professional associations to support them, as well as students' groups who voice their criticism of policies carried out by the Israeli government. It is vital that professional associations stand up against the complacency of university managers from University of Glasgow all the way to LSE. On a more personal note, as an Israeli Jew who moved to the UK 5 years ago, I do think it is vital for everyone to recognize that anti-Semitism is alive and well in the United Kingdom. Even as hate speech and hate crimes directed at other racialized groups in this country are more prevalent and more pronounced, Jews are subjected to hateful utterances. Indeed, my two sons, who frequent a comprehensive school here in East London, have been subjected to anti-Semitism. And while they have not felt unsafe, it was an unsettling experience. What I'm trying to say is that it is precisely because my boys have had such an experience that I find the University of Glasgow's Jewish student group email and the way the university's management handled the complaint so troubling. What we have witnessed here is not only the mobilization of an inadequate definition of anti-Semitism to defame a colleague who has carried out rigorous research on Israel and Palestine and they do it in order to stifle his academic freedom and to create a chill effect against all of us. But what we also see here is a cry wolf, a false charge that in effect undermines the struggle against anti-Semitism and other manifestations of racist hate speech. Indeed, the tragic irony of this whole affair is that the university has not only undermined academic freedom through its dealing with Dr. Sen, but has also undermined the fight against anti-Semitism and racism more generally by treating anti-Semitism both in a fake way and as exceptional. So I will now turn to Rhys Machold. Rhys is a faculty member in politics and international relations at the University of Glasgow, but will be speaking in his capacity as a branch committee member of UCU Glasgow that also resisted the way the management has handled this whole affair. And after his brief comments, Dr. Sen will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. But we'll get to Dr. Sen in a minute. Yes, please, Rhys.
Thanks so much, Neve, and to the organizers for inviting me tonight. So I'm very happy to be joining you all here today to extend a message of support and solidarity to you, Somdeep, from our membership at UCU Glasgow. As Neve has already elaborated, the circumstances that bring us together are extremely troubling and also dangerous, but they are also by no means new or isolated events. As a member of the UCU branch organizing against our university's adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, I can safely say that as shameful and shocking as the handling of Somdeep's talk has been, it is not entirely surprising. The decision to adopt the IHRA definition was formally taken by Glasgow on the 16th of November 2020. This decision was reported to the University of Cork through Human Resources on the 11th of February 2021. It was done very quietly, however, and even today, very few members of the Glasgow community are aware that the IHRA definition has been adopted, let alone what its adoption means in practice. As a UCU branch, we've been working to uncover the justifications for adopting the IHRA definition and to raise awareness about its implications for our university community. I should also note that our challenges to the university's adoptions did lead them to drop the adoption of the 11 examples, though the significance of this minor victory remains debatable. At UCU Glasgow, we share a concern over what the adoption of the definition means for research, teaching, and university life more broadly. As a UCU branch, we also seek in such concerns as labor issues, which affect our conditions of work. Simply put, the adoption of the IHRA definition interferes with our ability to teach and do research by creating irreconcilable contradictions. This is because the definition conflates legitimate criticism of the Israeli state and Zionism with anti-Semitism. And as Glasgow's handling of Somdeep's talk makes all too clear, these concerns are anything but abstract. The tone of the correspondence with Somdeep and BRISMES, moreover, reflects Glasgow management's broader lack of transparency and accountability in how they've gone about adopting and implementing the IHRA definition. Over the past few months, we have uncovered other concerning implications of the IHRA definition's adoption. These include ongoing charges of anti-Semitism against Glasgow staff members. For all these reasons, our local UCU branch has consistently demanded and continues to demand that the adoption of the IHRA definition be repealed. We also demand an official reckoning of how it came to be adopted in the first place. We anticipate this will be a long and difficult fight, and one which will require building forms of local, national, and international solidarity. We hope today's event will help to illuminate our concerns to a wider audience, but also to forge solidarities between our struggle and those elsewhere. Our local branch is not merely seeking to have the IHRA definition repealed, however. We're also seeking to redefine efforts to fight racism at Glasgow and decolonize the university, away from the empty platitudes and apparently unserious commitments to promoting inclusivity and freedom of expression by our management. To my mind, there seems no better place to begin such efforts than in relation to the subject of decolonizing Palestine. I and other members of UCU Glasgow present today are grateful to have the opportunity to hear what promises to be a fascinating and stimulating talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Rhys. And now, before Dr. Sen begins his talk, I only want to thank Amy Brickhill for organizing the event and all the amazing work she's done to make it happen. All questions are invited. You can either write your question down in the chat, and we will organize them and read them out loud to Dr. Sen. Or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you and allow you to talk. Any kind of question is legitimate so long as it is not trying to sabotage the event. If someone does try to sabotage the event, we will have to remove the person from this Zoom conference. So now, without further ado, Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this. It's been a particularly unpleasant few weeks having to deal with Glasgow, but I know some of you, and I recognize your faces, your names from messages of solidarity and support that you've emailed me or sent out through social media, and that has really made this process bearable. And I'm happy to finally be able to give this book talk. And I'm trying not to psych myself up. It was just supposed to be a book talk, and it is embedded in something else altogether. But I think I was joking to Neve. I was like, I got to do a good job at this point because can't mess up at this point, right? Nonetheless, I'm going to try to share my screen. Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas, between the Anticolonial and the Postcolonial. In the next 35 minutes, what I'll try to do is basically walk through the journey of the book, how the book really came about, and that also, how the book came about also gives a sense of how the central arguments my book fell into place. Before moving on to three key agendas I had with the book, which is to normalize Gaza, globalize Hamas, and talk about the long and often idiosyncratic path towards liberation. Dealing with these issues of academic freedom pushed me to think back to where this project started, which was 10 or 11 years ago, 10 years ago, when I started as a PhD here in Copenhagen, in Denmark, where I came into a discussion of Hamas that I saw as a way of talking more broadly about Palestine, but also engaging even more broadly on liberation, and I was interested through my PhD to discuss or analyze the genealogy of liberation movements, where they start, how they move, and what is the end of liberation, and when are we really liberated? Of course, what I encountered when I started with this project was the disciplinary norms and politics and limits of the study of Palestine. So, it sort of reminded me of this when we're talking about academic freedom, and now more broadly with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Back in 2011, I also felt that there were limitations to what kind of theoretical approaches I could use, what kind of methodological approaches I could use within the field of political science to study an organization like Hamas. So on the one hand, my interest was, terminology of postcolonialism, settler colonialism, liberation, anticolonial arms struggle in a Fanonian perspective. 10 years ago, in a largely traditional political science department, it was often explicitly, but sometimes implicitly, made clear to me that that kind of terminology would push me out of the mainstream of the discipline, which meant that as a young PhD, I was young at the time, I quickly changed tracks, and I found the title of my first paper that I wrote as a PhD in 6 months after starting my PhD program. Very clear, cookie cutter political science puzzle, civil military relations, something, a theoretical perspective that you usually apply to a state, the relationship between the military and the civilian body, and how does an armed non-state actor deal with these two aspects of the operational scope, the civil aspects and the military operations. So that was my entry into Hamas, where, as is evident, from this title, the broader discussion of liberation was taken out of it when I first entered into the field. In fact, I was even told not to go to the field, not to conduct field work in Gaza, because that's not what political science is supposed to do. And then I was told that if something happened in the field, then it's not the responsibility of the department. I called the insurance company after this conversation with our head of our PhD program, and then they said that I was covered, so that was fine. Of course, once you start engaging in ethnographic work and you do field work, you realize that you can't escape the context. You can't escape the liberation context in which liberation context that I was engaging in. And that you are entering, as Fanon would call it, the sector of the colonized, became quite clear to me when you are at the border between Egypt, the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and Gaza. And I start with an account of my experience at that border, where Palestinian travelers and travelers in general are basically at the mercy of Egyptian soldiers. When you come in, when you drive in your car and your taxi or whatever mode of transportation you take, at that time you were driving into the barrel of an Egyptian tank, and then you go to the gate, and the Egyptian army officer would take your ID, and then you just wait at the border for 20, 30 minutes, or sometimes an hour, and it's when they feel like they let you in. Once you go in, you enter what is on the left side of your screen, the passport terminal of the Egyptian side. Here, what you see there is the passport desk, and on each side of that desk are these speakers of a PA system where only one of the speakers works, and they'd yell out your name, and then they'll throw the passport at you, and then you're allowed to leave. So the Palestinian traveler said to me, they treat Palestinian travelers there as cattle. But then when you go out of the Egyptian terminal, you sort of enter the Palestinian terminal. You see the sign, "Welcome to Palestine," and you go in with very well-dressed Hamas Palestinian Authority soldiers. There's a very swanky passport control desk where you're asked questions like, "Why are you here? How long are you going to stay here? Who invited you?" And there was this performance of a normal passport control desk, which I thought was difficult to wrap my head around. And that was almost the entirety of my experience in Gaza, where at some moments you could see that this is the sector of the colonized, and yet at moments you felt like there was this performance of an era after the flight of the colonized. In the book, I talk about walking around in the bazaar. That reminds me a lot of the bazaars that I grew up around in India. Yet, you see pictures of martyrs. At some point, I had to go get an extension of my visa, which is a bizarre experience because Palestinian factions do not have the sovereignty to let me in or out of Gaza. Even Hamas officials. Funny enough, I had to buy a suit in Gaza because the Hamas officials I wanted to interview were acted like suited bureaucrats, and I was prepared to talk to revolutionaries. Of course, when I suited up and talked to them, even while they were suited, they were talking about liberation. So this constant back and forth between the language of an anti-colonial struggle embedded in a settler colonial condition and this performance of post-coloniality is what I kept encountering. And at that time, this is 2013, 2014, 7 years since the Palestinian Legislative Council election, the main puzzle that everyone was interested in was when is Hamas going to give up one of these operations, being between being an arms struggle and being this sort of governing entity. And eventually, the argument was that eventually it had to give up one of these. Yet, when I interviewed Palestinians in Gaza, but also Hamas officials, at least discursively, they were less concerned about whether or not these two modes of operation were sustainable. They were more concerned with how they lived or coexisted alongside each other within a liberation context. And that's what my project then became. It became about deliberating how the anti-colonial and this post-coloniality inhabits alongside each other within a settler colonial condition. When I formulated the project in that way, that opened up a few things, right? On the one hand, allowed me to build on this expansive work that has been done on settler colonialism in Palestine and connect Palestine and Gaza to a broader discussion of settler colonialism and the foundational element of the settler colonial dream of the indigenous non-existent. And I'll talk later about how Gaza fits into this. But sort of the second chapter of my book deals with, the second chapter of the book sort of sets up this contextual background of the settler colonial elimination of the indigenous, the myth of the settler colonial myth of the indigenous non-existence. One of the aspects of it that I discuss in the book is the biological elimination of Palestine and Palestinians. Right? Of course, historically, we go back to the Nakba to talk about the biological elimination of Palestine and Palestinians. But I also talk about the continuation of this elimination, evident through, say, the manner in which the Awad sisters, these teenagers who were shot dead in Mahne Yehuda in Jerusalem outside the Shuk when they were swinging their scissors at bystanders in late 2015 during what people call the knife intifada, and regular citizens shot them. They didn't just shoot them to stop the attacks. They shot to kill. They were continuously shot to, and bystanders ensured that they were indeed dead. Another incident that I draw on or talk about is this the killing of Haftom Zarhoum. He was an Eritrean asylum seeker at the Beersheba bus stop in 2015, and he was misidentified as a as a Palestinian terrorist. And he was not just shot by security officials. I forget how many minutes. I have it somewhere here. For several minutes afterwards, for 16 minutes afterwards, he was kept in his place as other citizens walked by, Israelis walked by and kicked him and his lifeless body. So I talk about just the, killing, the biological elimination is about, is not just sort of the killing of an individual, but killing of the supposed Palestinianness that they embody in their being, right? But I, of course, also talk about in chapter 2 about the cultural elimination of Palestine. We talk about food. I have this incident of Palestinian activists confronting Conan O'Brien because he mentioned at some point that a dish was Israeli, which it wasn't. You could clearly see Conan O'Brien being baffled why this was so important, but from within the context, those that understand the workings of the settler colonial elimination of Palestine know the importance of these cultural markers of Palestine and Palestinians, and how the elimination of that is detrimental to the liberation context. So within that context, I then, with that context in the background, I move on to talk about Hamas's arms struggle in view of a Fanonian perspective, Fanon's understanding of anti-colonial violence, where I argue that violence has the ability to both unmake and make. Unmake as a destructive process, and the material destruction of the colonial project, the settler colonial project, is of course foundational to the logic of anti-colonial arms struggles globally. Of course, I argue that Hamas's violence, the materiality of Hamas's violence, doesn't have the ability to materially unmake Israel's settler colonial endeavor, to unmake the siege, to unmake the occupation. But what it does is to continuously remind the existence of Palestine and the Palestinian cause, and works to even nominally make the colonial endeavor a difficult endeavor to maintain. Of course, the material destruction, the material effects of the colonized anti-colonial struggle, armed struggle, is often felt most by the colonized people due to the material difference between the colonizer and the colonized. And in the book, I argue that even in the pain, deaths, the mutilations, the injuries, the suffering that occurs as a consequence, as a repercussion of the anti-colonial arms struggle, even in that, through my ethnographic data, I show Palestinians talking about their Palestinianness being emboldened through those experiences of pain and injury. Even in death, it might be a death of an individual, but when that individual is in procession, the body is wrapped in the Palestinian flag and becomes not just an individual a tragedy, but a Palestinian tragedy. So even in tragedy, the signature of Palestine is underlined. This, of course, works as a contradiction or as a counter-argument to settler colonial claims that Palestine doesn't exist, or Palestinianness doesn't exist. Then, of course, I talk about the post-colonial. And here we have to recognize that Oslo Accords played a central role in the arrival of post-coloniality in Palestine. And it was sold as the precursor to the eventual Palestinian state, but we know well that it wasn't. What it did was work to incentivize post-coloniality. By that, it changed the subjective identity of the liberation faction of the liberation subjectivity, to keep Palestinian faction busy with statecraft and then spend less time actually fighting Israel. So incentivizing postcoloniality meant allowing Palestinian factions who agreed with the basic premise of the Oslo Accord, the seat at the table, seat at negotiations, allowed them the resources or gave them access to the resources of statecraft that is provided, by donors through the Palestinian Authority. Of course, disincentivized, not being disincentivized anti-coloniality, as we've seen through the violence that is often perpetuated by the security forces of the Palestinian Authority that we've seen over the summer. Moving on, then it meant bringing this post-colonial governance in the settler colonial context. So how is the state-like conduct socialized within a liberation context? And from Hamas's perspective, it argued that it imbued the post-colonial state with the anti-colonial ethos, which is of course not abnormal. This is a discourse that liberation factions often use, where they take on the colonial state. The national movement takes on the colonial state, but say that now we have imbued it with the signature of the national struggle. Right? Gazans, of course, often experience the violence of disciplinary violence of the state-like entity that Hamas governs, and even in a tragic sense, Gazans that I interviewed would often say, in a tragical sense, they identify this as a form of Palestinian governance. Right? Once again, even in an inadvertent way, the signature of Palestine becomes emboldened in this manner in which that the post-colonial state operates in this settler colonial context. So the book ends with bringing this post-colonial and anti-colonial, showing the applicability of these two, of the post-colonial and the anti-colonial, and the way in which they live in a liberation context. Then I sort of ended up asking, so what? And then I moved a bit broader and contextualized the comparing with liberation context around the world. It showed me that, of course, alongside the anti-colonial, the post-colonial often existed in liberation contexts around the world, in liberation movements around the world, long before the colonizer took flight. It, of course, wasn't as institutionalized as it is in Palestine, but I bring up an example of a dorm in India where student activists would operate the dorm like a state. And that was a way to, both to show the colonizer that we exist, we are a people, we're organized, and we deserve independence. But it also, I would argue, that works as a way of telling yourself, we are a people, we exist, and we deserve to be liberated. And there's a liberation struggle we eventually will win. But the anti-colonial and the post-colonial, two ways of being that one would usually associate it as located on either side of the moment that the colonizer takes flight. And I'm showing in the book through the case of Hamas that, well, it can and it does live alongside each other long before the colonizer leaves. But then I also, looking at the genealogy of liberation movements around the world, it shows that just as the anti-colonial and the post-colonial coexist before the flight of the colonizer, so does the struggle for liberation continue long after the colonizer leaves. And that has less to do with the fallacies of the anti-colonial struggle, or the weakness of the anti-colonial struggle, but also has to do with the effect colonialism has on the subjective identity of a people. where you are left with the institutions, the historical experience and the memory of 100, 200, 300 years of colonial rule. And the very purpose of colonial rule was to remove the memory of indigeneity that you ever had. So long after the colonizer leaves, the struggle for liberation continues because you are still trying to conjure that sense of indigeneity that is disconnected from this experience of colonial, from this experience of colonial rule. Yet you tragically often don't have the memory of what it means to be indigenous in that way, not affected by this experience of colonialism. So I end the book by arguing that the moment of liberation is not a moment at all. It is a long moment that begins long before the colonizer leaves, but it is often forced to continue long after the flight of the colonial rule, thus reducing the importance of that moment of independence that we often celebrate. In discussing Hamas in this way and Gaza in this way, I wanted to do a couple of things. One thing I wanted to do was normalize Gaza. Now, Gaza is often discussed as a particularly contemptible place that lives outside the norms of how we talk about the normal conversation on Israel-Palestine. And with the siege, of course, discussion, the marginalization of Gaza has taken place in scholarly discourse. But it has also led to Gaza becoming this particularly contemptible place that we bring up to justify, by calling an exceptionally bad place, we also justify exceptional action. Donna Neville has this nice formulation. She called it "but Hamas," where you can have a normal conversation of Israel-Palestine, but you can just say "but Hamas" to sidestep that, right? And sidestep all sense of decency. I had similar experiences while doing field work in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, where you had, especially during what was called the Knife Intifada, where people who identify themselves as liberals and progressives would talk in a very supportive manner of young Palestinians and the suffering of young Palestinians in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Yet when I brought up Gaza, that was a different conversation. We cannot talk about Gaza. But in this book, I wanted to normalize Gaza. By that, I mean that Gaza is not exceptional. In fact, Gaza, demographically, historically, felt the brunt of what I called earlier the biological elimination of Palestine. When, following the Nakba, it was flooded by Palestinian refugees and quickly became a place where refugees were the demographic majority. And through what Sarah Roy has often described as the de-development of the Gaza Strip, what we've seen that Gaza has always been a place that has been the training ground of revolutionary figures. It's a place that starts intifadas, and it's a place that starts the Great March of Return, and the place that has always historically been indomitable in anti-colonial struggle. And in fact, alongside Jerusalem, Edward Said once called Gaza the center of the Palestinian struggle. Right? Now, Gaza is also normal. The treatment of Gaza at the hands of Israeli authorities is also normal, because if we consider the settler colonialism as to be based on this myth of terra nullius, that Israel was built on a land without a people, then by being indomitable in its anti-colonial struggle, Gaza presents itself as the loudest critique of that counter-argument, loudest critique of that myth of terra nullius, right? Which is why it's not surprising that Israeli authorities and politicians have a particular hatred for Gaza. Rabin talked about sinking Gaza into the sea, and they use these terms of politicians. They use these terms of mowing the grass and so on and so forth. through normalizing Gaza, I also wanted to globalize Hamas, where while Gaza or Palestine was introduced to me in a global context by someone called John Collins, some of you may know, wrote this book called Global Palestine. So to me, the discussion of Palestine was always embedded in a global discussion of anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, settler colonialism. Yet, and as we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of, there's been fantastic scholarship of on Palestine being placed on that prophetic index. That discussion has largely escaped Hamas, barring a few. I can see Catherine is here. Catherine deals with Hamas in a more global context. Mark Ayash is someone whose work I've been inspired by. So I wanted to place Hamas by using, I wanted to place Hamas and Gaza and Palestine in that context, alongside the pantheon of anti-colonial struggles and post-colonial statecraft that exists around the world, which meant that showing the applicability of these theoretical works, not just in Palestine, but in Gaza and Hamas, but also using Hamas in that prophetic index to say something more broadly about liberation and the genealogy of liberation struggle, which is why the book sort of ends. The book starts with Gaza, but ends with a discussion of Palestine alongside India, Tanzania, Kenya, Kashmir. I even brought up some of my ethnographic insights from Tanzania and my own personal experience and own personal musings about what it means to be independent and liberated as an Indian. Finally, the book ends with this broad argument of liberation, being not contingent on the withdrawal of the colonized, and arguing that the struggle for liberation continues long after the flight of the colonizer. And I end with the question: can the struggle for liberation ever end? But by engaging in these sort of broad, depressing questions, the idea was never to move away from the everyday experience of a liberation context, the everyday experience of the genealogy of a liberation struggle, which is why I was very much inspired by the Frantz Fanon, where I was very much inspired by the work of Frantz Fanon, where a lot of people focus on his, the wretched of the earth, yet many ignore the struggles he himself and he writes about, of his craving for whiteness and his questioning his own blackness and what it means to be Martin, and the cultural cachet that comes with being more French. And those idiosyncrasies and struggles are important to understand how we end up with Wretched of the Earth. In a similar way, the book is in a way, for those who've read it, it's in a way schizophrenic, where I move back and forth between the very nitty-gritty everyday experience of Palestinians, and then engage with a more wider discussion of what it means to be liberate. And it's important to recognize these, and by saying that, by questioning, or wondering when liberation ends, or talking about the idiosyncrasies of the liberation struggle, my argument was not to trivialize the anti-colonial struggle, but to recognize how difficult it is, or what it entails being a colonizer, or to live in a settler colonial condition, how it affects the subjective identity of an individual struggling against the colonizer, yet having the supermarket being flooded with the colonizer's product, or having to use the colonizer's currency, or being both beaten up by the Palestinian faction and being shot by Israelis. What does that do to an individual and their sense of self, and their sense of self is Palestinian. And it's important, I think, and I try to do that in the book, where I jump between these broad discussion of what it means to be liberated, but also leveraging these discussions through these everyday struggles, this long, convoluted struggle of a liberation of a colonized people moving towards liberation. So, yeah, thank you.